I don't anticipate that my voice will last through an hour and 15 minutes here and probably not much more than an hour in lab, but I'm happy to be back, more or less. Stay away. It's our whole. If you ever had Dr. Dress, we're blaming him. He was the first one. Just pointing it out. Hey, the first one is at least five of us. Out of that, there's only like maybe 10 people, maybe nine, eight, nine full time in the science division. Oh, I give up. Nevertheless, that's where we are. So, well, I'm optimistic that I can finish endocrine today, and maybe even introduce blood a little bit. So that's really we're finishing it, and normally by this time I would have started to looking at when and what the contents would be of a first exam, but I haven't. Like everything kind of stopped for a few days. I'm not I really just now starting to get back into it. So hopefully I'll maybe over this weekend I'll start to have some ideas and let you know next week or via email. So it's not like I haven't forgotten that. And if I'm really on top of my game, I'll bring in the scantrons, which I threatened to do yesterday but didn't for my other lab. So it's okay. What can I tell you? Nevertheless, further ado, on to this. These are now, other than we did the pituitary, now these are all the other glands that are sort of in it. Not all, but a great many of the other glands. And we get to some of the other structures as we begin to encounter them, at least for our purposes. And this is one of the ones. Did I start recording already? That little red light went on. Oh, yeah, there it is. Happy days. So here we go. So this is the start. It would be nice if they put thyroid on top of it, but it's there. Okay. Very easy. A very fleshy, relatively small glandular structure basically on top of your Adam's apple, more on either side, with a little fleshy piece that goes across it called the isthmus. That's there, a little mass that connects. The two lobes are larger, and it principally it's all about this. The major secretion is called thyroglobulin. Very interesting, and I sort of alluded to it before. Your thyroid kind of makes everything else time the way it's supposed to. So whether it's reproduction, whether it's metabolism, whether it's digestion, as long as that thyroid, it's the governor, and it basically keeps your engine idling. So when you turn the car on, you get that nice type of thing, and you know how regular it is if you have the car kind of grates or grinds or sounds lousy. That would be the sort of the analogy to the thyroid wasn't working when it was racing or very sluggishly starting, that type of thing. And we look inside where this globulin that's being made by the thyroid gland collects, and it usually stains a sort of a pink color with the stains that they use, and certainly the ones that you see, called, as you can see, they're called follicular cells, or the follicle itself. And these cells make it. It's very, very well understood, this particular gland. When I say it to every class, this is thyroids are very, very busy and active. It's a gland, unfortunately, like a lot of other glands, is predisposed to cancer. If somebody held a gun to your head and said, "Hey, you have a cancer," you might pick thyroid because it's nearly 100% curable. And it's not often you see that. We use terms like curable is a rare word. Treatable is a good word. Curable is an amazing word because generally you just have to excise the portion that's diseased or the thyroid in its entirety carefully, and and people survive on thyroid supplement for forever, not problematically. So it's sort of an odd in that regard. That's there. So I'll just let you look. So the fluid that accumulates, very interesting, is called colloid. And a colloid, you might recall, is something like milk is a colloid. It's very, very proteinaceous and it holds water to it. So it's like milk. You know what happens when milk spoils? And all of a sudden you'll see, basically, if you ever make cheese at home, you begin to you heat up milk and you put like lemon juice in it or something like that, and all of a sudden you get the curds and whey thing. Remember cider, that type of stuff. Okay, milk will curdle. So proteins, when they're not curdled, will hold on to it. Hence the name colloid from that. So it contains this thyroglobulin, and as long as iodine, key player here, is present, it's the precursor to thyroid hormone. For you in the imaging area, that's why we use a lot of iodinated compounds. So use for one of the earliest ones, was it I-131, something like that. Okay, so radioactive labeled iodine, and even before advances in nuclear medicine, we were just using iodine-based dyes to do things like uh, IVPs, intravenous pyelograms, which I used to do, or intravenous cholangiograms. We'd start an IV and you inject a dye that has radiopaque iodine in it, and it would collect either in and around the gallbladder or in and around the kidneys, ureters, and bladder, and sort of outline it and took plain films. That was the technology back 50 years ago when I was a resident and doing these types of things. There are also some other cells that are next to, and if you will, less important, make a hormone called calcitonin, which probably plays a more active role in young people and growing bone and making sure calcium gets put into growing bone. Here it is, it's sandwiched in an area that's crossed by all the major blood vessels you can just about think of: the aortic arch, the carotid arteries, the subclavian arteries, the vertebral arteries, and most of these come from the thyroid arteries, and it's replete. It's just filled with blood vessels. When you excise these, you have to carefully dissect it, clamp every single blood vessel, and either tie it off or cauterize it and excite it as a unit. And if you're not careful with that, it will bleed excessively. And if you're in a clinical sphere where you see somebody who has had thyroid surgery, the very first order you write on the post-op, you don't have to write it anymore. The very first order we were taught to write in the post-operative chart was have a trach tray on board at bedside immediately post-operatively, because if it swells, then you're going to have to do a tracheotomy for them to be able to. That's how much. And I scrubbed in. I never did one, but I scrubbed in held retractors and watched these very elaborate surgeries to remove thyroids. So this is what it looks like. Here's that pink stuff's the globulin. This is the thin layer of cells. Mostly these are the follicle cells. Their job is to make this. They make this protein. And then you have some of these parafollicular cells are here. They're making the calcitonin. They're more relevant in bone than anything else. And so what happens is once you take that globulin and you add iodine to it, now you're either going to add 4 molecules of iodine or 4 atoms rather, or 3, and hence you get the names T4 and T3. And at the tissue level, all of them effectively become T4. Okay, so there's varying types of activities. They are iodine-containing amino hormones, and again, because it's 2 identical tyrosines that are sort of one's upside down and one's right side up, it's a very, very symmetrical molecule. That's why this is more in the category. This is not more, but it is in the category of fat soluble versus, even though it's made out of amino acids, something that would normally be protein based and water soluble. Every cell in the body, target cell, intracellular receptors, transcription is affected, then translation. In general, it's calorogenic, which means it increases metabolic rate and heat production. So there almost is not a system that's not affected. Critical for normal skeletal and nervous system capabilities, maintains blood pressure, increasing the amount of receptors for epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are adrenergic receptors in blood vessels. The thyroid gland stores it in that lumen, within that follicle area, until it's ready to be really complete the synthesis. And then once it's converted, okay, by adding the trapped iodine, the ionic iodine, then we're ready to go. So the big deal here is adequate iodine, and we don't need a lot. Most of us do not need to go out and do anything to get extra iodine in. In poor countries, in countries that don't have certain aspects of their nutrition controlled, years ago, every so often you'd see somebody would have a goiter. A goiter is this big and large, it looks like, for all the world, it's like a giant tumor in front of their neck. All it is the globulin that accumulated, and because there was insufficient iodine, it would just get bigger and bigger because the body controls it by negative feedback. as long as there's thyroid, as long as the T3 and T4, the iodinated ones, are in the bloodstream, you don't make more of it. That's the sense level. As long as there's enough of it here, we don't have to make more of it. We have plenty to go around, or keep it at a steady level. But if you run out of iodine, now the globulin accumulates, it swells, but your bloodstream doesn't know it's stuck because it doesn't have iodine. All it knows is there's not enough T3 and T4. It sends a signal eventually to the pituitary, make more TSH. The TSH tells the thyroid to go into overdrive, and it swells, and it's a vicious cycle. So what's the treatment? Iodine. Easily enough. And so when they started to see this, they did something that all of us don't even think about. Now, I don't know what you use for salt at home, but I'm sure here on the campus, if they use those little salt packets and stuff like that, that's all iodized salt. They take standard sodium chloride and add a pinch of potassium iodine. And so you see it all the time, iodized salt. Now, if you, again, I cook, but if you like Himalayan pink salt or gray salt or Mediterranean sea salt, as many of us do for cooking, or good old kosher salt, and why not? Boom, like that. It isn't necessarily, some of that is iodized, some is not. So you can, and that's a matter of looking at the labels and things like that. But you get one of these, go to a fancy cooking store, and they'll have certain salts because somebody wants to duplicate a recipe they saw on TV. Doesn't necessarily have to be iodized. But you and I get enough of that stuff in our food, we don't even have to worry about it. Because salt is surely the most common of all the preservatives. So iodine eventually attaches, and it goes through the whole way. It's sort of tethered together and blah. Okay, and then eventually enzymes cleave this iodinated thyroid globulin into T3 and 4. Mostly T4 is secreted, but T3 is also, and they had it backwards. I shouldn't have just read that to you. T3 is the active product. So if it's not T3, the T4 has to make T3. And whenever we evaluate somebody with thyroid disorders, we look at T3 levels, T4 levels, thyroid stimulating hormone levels. We look at all of those levels to be able to determine if that's it. And that's one of the things that it's not probably normal on what's called a BMP, or basic metabolic panel, which is the standard panel you might run on somebody being admitted to the hospital. But it's something that you would add to it depending on what the nature of the admission was. And that's kind of what you do. You generally, an initial test or a basic metabolic panel, CBC, urinalysis, and you sort of go from there, depending on what it is. And then you start adding stuff as necessary. So they give you a nice little way of showing how it works here. So the thyroid globulin is synthesized within those follicle cells and the usual endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus. Here it gets stored here, and it gets transported and eventually into this area where the colloid is stored. But then we get the iodine, and the iodine then makes these either ones with 2 or ones with 1. And then eventually, as you can see, they're symmetric. So you can see these two little guys are sort of, here they are, do them like this, what they call anti-parallel. And you have T4, and if it's a 2 and a 1, now you have T3, but still symmetrical enough. And then it gets into the bloodstream. It has to pick up a carrier molecule because it's, technically speaking, fat soluble, and off it goes. So those are what the thyroxine binding globulins, if you're wondering, not that important to us. Both bind to target. T3 is 10 times more active. That's why we convert it. And the enzyme just lops off that extra iodine. That's it. Negative feedback. Rising thyroid hormone levels provide feedback inhibition. We've got plenty in here. Stop making more. Can also be inhibited by various other things. That's the growth inhibitory hormone, dopamine, increasing levels of cortisol and iodide. So depending on it, generally, when you're releasing lots of cortisol, it's a time of stress, just to give you an idea. Same thing would be with the dopamine, a kind of stress that you're under. And generally in stress, you don't need to make more, because then it almost will spiral out of control. Okay, and so and it's based again on this arc. It's red in the hypothalamus. It uses the thyrotropin releasing hormone that nudges the the pituitary to make thyroid stimulating hormone and release it, and it goes to the thyroid and does this treatment. We kind of saw a little bit about this before. And they don't have to show you, but maybe they will. But look at what it does. System, basic metabolic rate, food metabolism, nervous system, cardiovascular, muscle, skeletal, GI, repro, integumentary. So all of these things are part of it. So it's really a substantial part of all of our bodies functioning normally. So that's why it's so important for that to be in order. So interesting terms that sometimes we see. If there's not enough, it's called, what it presents is something called myxedema, is how you pronounce it. Okay. And this is, sometimes you do, in my experience, you sometimes see the swelling, which is really what the myxedema is like, this increase in maybe fluid that hasn't been processed and gotten rid of effectively. But these people are generally, when we think about somebody who's hypothyroid, they're very slow in what their activities are. Typically, we see thick or dry skin. Sometimes that fluid tends to go behind the eyes. We'll see more of that in a second. Okay, puffy eyes, chilled. They're more cold than they are warm. Your GI system doesn't work as effectively. Their urinary system doesn't get rid of extra fluid. So constipation and edema, and all of those things sometimes in worse presentations. And so that's one of the things they used to look for, particularly when folks were maybe demonstrating what might have been a kind of mental illness. It may have very well just been related, being a metabolic problem that was solvable, as opposed to being some psychological or mental problem. And so the other thing is that goiter, and that just goes through that way. And so the thyroid responses to enlarge, it doesn't know that it's about the iodine. It just keeps making more of the globulin, and the globulin just keeps swelling. And unfortunately, the bloodstream still doesn't think you have enough. So all of these things, congenital hypothyroidism, poor development of the glands, all things. We can always implicate maternal medications. Sometimes they're asymptomatic. Okay. A thyroid hormone replacement is typically what, once it's identified, again, it's relatively easy to solve that because thyroid supplements have been around forever. It's harder to treat excessive thyroidism in some ways, but then you're almost looking at having to, again, remove the thyroid and supplement anyway. And so we see different kinds of it. We used to have somebody, we get home, we had a pet, my stepdaughter had a pet that had a chronically active thyroid that they had to give a medicine to slow it down. So as I recall, but years ago, the cat's not around anymore, unfortunately. Okay, that's what a goiter would look like. So it's not a tumor, it's just that swelling that's accumulated there. This is interesting. So normally it looks like it kind of resembles a goiter behind the eye. It's a bunch of fluid. It's got a famous name. It's called Graves' disease. Okay. And it's actually an autoimmune disease. The body makes antibodies directed at the follicular cells. Those antibodies act like thyroid stimulating hormones, so they cause it to be released. And so you get a kind of hyperthyroidism, high metabolic rate, rapid pulse, nervous, all that type. And one of the things we do see a lot of, for whatever reason, I can't give you the mechanism, is called an exophthalmic goiter. So rather than the fluid being here, as we do with the iodine, it causes these eyes to pop out. Okay? And again, surgical removal, radioactive iodine, and then supplemented. And they always show you this illustration. And so I show these to you because they're little things that one day you'll see something like that, because it's not as uncommon as you think. There are little things like that kind of are little giveaways that you see, and all of a sudden, in the back of your mind, I wonder if this is impactful. And you might see that when you look at somebody's list of medications or things like that, if you're in the healthcare tree. Here's the calcitonin, responds to high calcium levels to some very, very limited extent. It antagonizes or offsets parathyroid hormone, not a lot. A lot of us, again, it's one of those areas, I hate to say controversial, but at least under discussion. as to what it actually does. Does it actually play a role in adults? We don't really know. Is it more active in children? Most likely. So, but at higher than normal doses, it does tend to slow down osteoclast activity so that you aren't losing calcium from bone. And so the theory would be that, and at least at different times it's been tried, or variations have been tried, to try to deal with osteoporosis. And osteoporosis is an enormous problem that a tremendous amount of people, mostly women, face. Same illustration you saw before. Voila, that's it. Enough thyroid. So we're not done yet. The thyroid you can remove, you can supplement. If you remove a thyroid, it's very easy to inadvertently and mistakenly remove those. That person's going to die. Thyroid is, we can deal with if it's not working or it's removed. Parathyroid, we cannot. It is essential. Without it, you cannot survive. They're tiny little, slightly different color, different texture, glandular structures on the posterior aspect of the thyroid. They have a different kind of cell structure. Oxyphil cells, nobody really knows about them. The parathyroid cells, and we always use that abbreviation for parathyroid hormone. That's the biggest hormone that controls calcium. And if nothing comes of AP2, it underscores how extraordinarily important calcium is for everything. Calcium for your heart to work, calcium for your nerves to work, calcium you already know about for your muscles to work. Calcium, calcium, calcium. So you really have to be on top of that kind of a thing. And the parathyroid hormone does that. It's the one that keeps calcium homeostatic. So if it's fairly straightforward on a bone level, if there's not enough calcium in the bloodstream, parathyroid hormone is activated more so than usual and pulls calcium out of the bone, which is really its repository. It's like, hey, I'm going out shopping. I need some money. I got to take it out of my bank account. Okay. And hey, I got a couple of deals. I got like 6 things yesterday, half off at the thrift store. Hey, so then you don't need, so I didn't, so you can turn around and put it back in the bank. That's when you don't need as much parathyroid hormone. Maybe you'll have a little calcitonin in your pocket and say, put this money back in the bank in the form of calcium. It targets 3 areas. Okay. Most famously, in all of these areas for parathyroid hormone have one end effect. They increase available calcium in the bloodstream. So where does it come from? 3 places where we can latch on to calcium and get it back in the bloodstream. Number 1, the hip rate, bone. So what does it do? It pulls it out of the bone. Number 2, your diet. So in your gut, it's able to bring calcium in and take it into the bloodstream. But in order to do that, it has to have a partner, and that partner's name is vitamin. So if you're taking calcium supplements, for whatever reason, nearly all of them either come with or recommend that you take increased amounts of vitamin D. You'll see things like Caltrate with vitamin D. For years, and I'm not as up on the nutrition as I used to be. My wife tells me it's a little different than what it was because she's not on that stuff. We used OzCal, which stood for oyster shell calcium, which is calcium carbonate. And maybe that's still the desirable calcium. I do not know if she takes that or not, but for years, my first wife did it all the time. But she had osteoporosis and she was very prone to it because she's very, very diminutive, very tiny. My first wife was barely 5 feet tall. She still is a person. She's not deceased, but she's shorter because of the osteoporosis. So what we like to call the incredible shrinking grandma, but you may have one of those. Your grandparents seem like they get, it's osteoporosis, compression fractures, like that. Okay, moving on. So it does that, and the other area it stops, the one with the vitamin D, is this one, and that's in your kidney. It doesn't need vitamin D there, okay, although the kidney plays a role in activating vitamin D. Basically, it pulls back calcium and it holds it so it's not excreted in the urine. So those are the three areas that are very, very busy. Directly from the skeleton, the bulk of the work. The kidneys, certainly important. The intestine, certainly important. Here they are in the back. This is the posterior aspect of the pharynx and the pharyngeal muscles that you can see here. Not a whole lot to gather from the slides. Okay. So how does it do its business? It stimulates osteoclasts. If you go back in bone, osteoclasts are not bone cells per se. They're a modified white blood cell, a macrophage, that are multicellular. They have something called a ruffled border. So they're like a little package that's all over bones. And when they're activated by parathyroid hormone, they release enzymes that break apart the bone, not just leach out the ionic elements or the inorganic. It's not just all about calcium. It breaks apart bone, and in the process, it releases calcium. That's the big mistake. People for years thought osteoporosis was only losing calcium. It's not. It's losing all of bone. That's why the bone appears so moth-eaten and almost ground glass appearance. It really looks bad. And when you see osteoporotic bone, it's not a pretty sight too. So it enhances the reabsorption of calcium. And typically, when calcium goes in one direction, phosphorus goes in the other direction. It's one of those. And we see a lot of those biologically. It's like sodium and potassium frequently go in opposite directions. So when your kidneys retain sodium, so you retain water, you tend to excrete more potassium. That's one of the problems why we don't use diuretics quite as much, other than in the hospital, because then you have low potassium, and when people's potassium gets too low, their heart arrhythmias begin to predominate. And we're going to look at that in the cardiac aspect of it. So what else it does? It activates vitamin D by the kidneys, which is going to work in the gut. Okay, plus the reabsorption in the kidney. So it plays a pivotal role in all those areas. And it just shows them to you. And again, the end product is this: increased calcium in the bloodstream. We call hypercalcemia, or increased emia means in the bloodstream. So whenever you see that, you know what that means: glucosemia or glycemia, with an increased amount of sugar. We're going to be getting to that. I don't think we'll finish all this today. So there are some odd cases where we see hyperparathyroidism and even some variations with regard to genetic faults of end targets, which I won't, go into at great depth. I mean, this is endocrinologists. This is one of their areas, as well as things like diabetes. They look a lot at what are called metabolic bone diseases. Most of them are disorders that are based on glandular activity. So they'll soften and deform. Now, when you have too much calcium, because you have an excessive amount, the nervous system will be depressed, and kidney stones. Okay, but from resulting easily fractured bone, fibrosis cystica, which means fibrous areas of bone rather than bone areas of bone, and little cysts or imperfection form within it. Okay, and this is the problem when you have this type of a problem. You don't have enough calcium. What happens is your muscles inevitably go into advanced spasm. That's what tetany is, and what happens, and you can't breathe. So when you hear the term tetanus is a microbiological phenomena that's associated with a disease entity, where the toxin is such that it causes the muscles to spasm. But the term, it derives its name, tetanus, isn't something that came from the disease. It comes from spasmed muscles. Okay, and so that's one of the things we do see with it: tetany, involuntary muscle spasms, and eventually death. It's one of the things you really worry about. Where you might see it is somebody who gets very, very sick and is losing fluid and electrolytes. Let's say they have some type of terrible illness associated with an infection from food, and they're vomiting and diarrhea. So they lose all sorts of electrolytes, both by vomiting and from diarrhea. And what will happen is you'll end up with such low calcium that you'll get involuntary muscle spasms. And I mean, that's usually that person's quite ill. You don't want to have it. You'll learn more about it when I tell you about it. I had it. I had a 3-day visit in intensive care back in 2006 from salmonella, food infection. And I ended up in so sick. I got whatever was tainted, and subsequently there was an outbreak of salmonellosis from like lettuce and tomato. It was mostly in Allegheny County. My likely came from Pineiros in Butler County. I was teaching up at BC3 at Butler Community College. And students, it was like we went like lab, lecture, lab. I had 2 lab sections sandwiched in a lecture in the middle in the summer session. We were near the end. We had like 3 days to go. And they said, hey, we're going to Panera's. You want a sandwich? I said, yeah, here's some money. Go get me a whatever. Put blah, 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 blah. Next day, I couldn't even make it out of the golf course. I was that sick. I was going from porta potty to porta potty. That was Tuesday. By Friday, I was in intensive care. So sick that at that point in time, it was 2006, they called, are you ready? My 87-year-old mom, who was still alive at that time, and 87 at that time, and told her I was close. Because I was. So you can get pretty sick pretty fast. Just saying. So much for that. I share that anecdote with all the classes. It kind of gets you an idea on how fast disease. I do it more in micro, so people can understand how fast microbiological diseases. I mean, we don't have to tell anybody that now with COVID. People know how sick COVID people got and how they became very, very ill very, very rapidly. As opposed to that, infectious diseases are never, never, never a good thing. But it's important, I think, that we all have a context for that as well. The adrenal glands are, and this is not the one that you learned about with the adrenal medulla with adrenaline or epinephrine or norepinephrine or adrenaline or noradrenaline, however it was described to you. These are the external portion. These are the adrenal cortical glands. Remember, medulla in the middle, cortex on the outside. There's 3 layers. They all make different stuff. So suprarenal means just above. Adrenal meant adjacent to the renal. That's how they got their name. So effectively 2 glands. The medulla, again, that's part of the sympathetic nervous system. That's universally agreed on now by most of us who are, have a certain degree of expertise in the field. The cortex, 3 layers of glandular tissue that create basically 3 different types of similar hormones. What's the unique feature of all of them? They're all made from cholesterol. No, you don't have, it's not about eating cholesterol. Most of the time when we have high cholesterol, it's more genetically based, it's more so than dietarily based. And if it's dietarily based, it's not so much about ingestion of fats, it's more about ingestion of my favorite thing, carbs. Even though it's miles out of my way, I don't mind having to go over to the Oakmont Bakery if I happen to be anywhere near there. Just for your Oakmont Bakery fan. Oakmont Bakery fan. Yeah, now we're talking. We like that stuff. Nevertheless, so what we're going to see are those parts of the tissue. So over 24 different hormones that are all, and they derive their name from as corticosteroids from cholesterol as being sort of the base unit for all of these. We make cholesterol in our body. Again, yes, we ingest it with a lot of the things that we eat. It's an extraordinarily important part of our membranes. It imparts stability, and it's the basis for a lot of these extraordinarily important hormones. So you have 3 zones. The outermost layer is called the glomerulosa. You don't have to know these names. The fascicula, you have to know what comes out of the layers. The fasciculata is called glucocorticoids, so they kind of gives it away. Mineralocorticoids have more to do with minerals, think sodium, perhaps as much as any. Glucocorticoids, glucose. And gonadocorticoids in the reticularis This is the only area in women, in the human body, where they normally make testosterone-like substances. And it's part of the underlying reason, along with menstruation in the adult female, as to why when we get to the blood unit, you will see that in general, women have proportionately lower red blood cell counts, because this is really the thing that works more, as much as any, on the bloodstream to account for that difference why men have a higher red count than women do. It's not to say that they're anemic, although that is a problem. So this is what they're giving you, both the, sort of the artist representation in this. It's not important, but you're just trying to demonstrate the three. Here's the medulla level, okay? But here you can see the relatively thin innermost layer, the reticularis, the relatively thick mid layer, the fasciculata, and then a modest size sort of in between layer, the glomerulosa. And again, you don't have to know the names, just know it comes out. So in the outer layer, the mineralocorticoids, and understand that there's a certain degree of overlap for the most part between those. Part of pharmacology has always been trying to, you can't take a mineralocorticoid typically without having some glucocorticoid effect, or vice versa. Okay, so they're not exactly pure substances in that regard. So regulate electrolyte concentrations, primarily sodium, and sodium and potassium are sort of intertwined in the extracellular fluid. And so what does sodium do? I mean, sodium is the big player here. Sodium is really a unique substance that has one remarkable factor. And I will tell this to you many times. It's what I like to call Stein's Mary Had a Little Lamb rule. You remember her, okay? Where sodium goes, water is sure to follow. That's why it's the Mary Had a Little Lamb rule. Okay. Just saying. How hard would that be to ever remember? Okay. So what does it do? Because sodium will, if water will go to it, you get the volume of fluid that imparts blood volume. Your blood pressure is directly related to blood volume, and it impacts, because some ionic substances, and we get to this a little bit in kidney, go with sodium, and some, like potassium, go in the opposite direction. Okay? So we begin to see that. You've already seen sodium and potassium with regard to resting membrane potentials, like in muscle, go in opposite fields. Those sodium potassium pumps, you pump the sodium back out, pump the potassium back in to reset the membrane for muscles, etc. So potassium sets that resting membrane potential. So it's a really important player. The single most important one of those is there, aldosterone. It is the way we maintain our internal blood pressure as much as anything else. Something we're going to go into a little bit here, and something we'll get into a little bit more, particularly when we get to kidney, into the blood pressure unit. And the kidney blood pressure unit is this mechanism. It's called the renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism. And so your kidneys, when they sense that your blood pressure is low, it's sort of an internal set. We don't have to do anything about it. When your blood pressure is sensed that it's low in there by pressure sensors and chemical sensors, it causes the cells there in a certain area of the kidney, a fancy name called the juxtaglomerular apparatus you'll learn about in kidney. What they do is it triggers angiotensin. Angiotensin is fairly straightforward. Angio means blood vessel, tensin means to tension, tightens it, raises your blood pressure. At the same time, because your blood pressure, other things that might make your blood pressure low, it does certain things. It makes you thirsty, so you take in more fluid. Pressure. That antidiuretic hormone we talked about earlier, sort of remotely when I was home, that makes you retain more water. Okay. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, it releases aldosterone. And aldosterone goes right to the kidney, and implants little openings that are designed to pull sodium out of the urine, and water will be sure to follow. Happy to. So it stimulates sodium reabsorption, and because they go typically in opposite direction, out goes the potassium. So short-lived, it synthesizes those sodium potassium ATPase pumps, the exchange pumps, part of it. Regulate aldosterone, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. Obviously, that impacts concentration of potassium. Some of that plays a role in the release of or the result of ACTH. Adrenocorticotropic hormone from the pituitary will trigger this pathway. It'll also, to some extent, when you have sufficient sodium levels, it will make it unnecessary for the pituitary to make this. And this is a very interesting hormone we're going to get to in the heart as well. A lot of people call it the anti-aldosterone. It's pronounced atrial natriuretic peptide. Natri means sodium. The old Latin name for sodium was natrium. That's why it has the Na on. Right? Atrial. So when you have too much fluid in your system, your atria are stretched. Okay? Because the atria normally, when we learn about the heart, are typically empty right away. When you have a backlog of fluid, they get stretched a little bit. It doesn't take much because they're pretty small. And when they stretch, those linings, as they stretch, release this chemical, a short-chain polypeptide called ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide. It works directly on the kidney. And what does it do? The opposite of aldosterone. It creates channels for sodium to leave and go into the urine. Natri means sodium. Uretic means into the urine, peptide. So it's the opposite of it. And we're going to see a lot of the interplay between these as you look more closely at not just endocrine, but kidney function and blood pressure function. So these are all topics we revisit. So here's that mechanism again. The cells in the kidney have lots of, we call them juxtaglomerular cells. They're really interesting. We'll take a look at them. They make these little granules of renin, okay? And it's interesting that this whole pathway, and it's sort of a recurring theme, we begin to see things called ogens. Ogens are inactive. Most proteins are released inactive and then are only activated with chemical signals. So angiotensinogen is what's released, and then it's converted eventually into something called angiotensin 2. It's a two-step process. It lops off some of the protein and makes it angiotensin 1, and then there's another step of activation, interestingly, in the lungs for angiotensin 2. When we talk about blood pressure, one of the most common blood pressure agents work directly on this. They're called ACE inhibitors. If you know anybody with high blood pressure, here's likely what they're taking. Something called a calcium channel blocker. Okay, and another one typically called an ACE inhibitor. It affects that pathway in some way, shape, or form. ACE means angiotensin converting enzyme. We're going to deal with that as well. I take 2 blood pressure pills every morning. One's a calcium channel blocker, and one's basically an ACE or a modified ACE. And if you looked at the top 10 blood pressure pills, they're probably in the top 5. So anybody with high blood pressure takes. So mineralocorticoids impact potassium, okay? Increased potassium directly stimulates aldosterone release because you're going to induce the kidneys to get rid of it. ACTH can impact it. Atrial natriuretic peptide secreted by the heart in the atria in response to high blood pressure will block the pathway and work against aldosterone. And there's just a summary chart that you can see that goes through it. If that helps you look at it, please do. Bad things happen. Aldosteronism. Typically tumor related. And what happens is when you have too much fluid retention, okay, excessive sodium, okay, and unfortunately high blood pressure, swelling, and eventually can be problems, as you can see, in the neuromuscular system. I want you to recall what I told you about the overlap. This is significant. Glucocorticoids. Forever. Before we had advanced agents that could treat, I probably told you this before, things like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis or rheumatoid arthritis or psoriatic arthritis or systemic lupus erythematosus, we had one treatment, steroids, along with a pill called sulfasalazine, which I still take. That was the only treatment you had. We didn't know how the sulfasalazine worked, and all you know about steroids of this type is they stabilize membranes and they reduce inflammation. So maybe you took something like this if you had a thing called a dose pack that you might have taken for poison ivy or a really bad rash. And we still give it to people for arthritic flares. I can't even tell you how many prescribed. They are in this category. They're made of a chemical called methylprednisolone. So most cells can help us resist stressors. So we release this under times of stress. We release the amount and increase the amount of blood glucose, and it tends to be in a response and act as an anti-inflammatory. It maintains your blood pressure, okay? And typically these are the way it's converted. The cholesterol is converted into active molecules. Eventually they all kind of become this way, cortisol or hydrocortisone. This is one we see in humans. There's also, we use these products topically. We have forever. Anybody can go and get 1% hydrocortisone cream at any pharmacy at Giant Eagle if you have a rash or something like that, something's irritated. Use it all the time. Most people do. It's released in response, again, to the ACTH. That's ACTH's name is adrenocorticotropic hormone. The one that comes from the posterior pituitary is called corticotropin releasing hormone. And it's always with low levels of cortisols. There's different patterns, and I touched on this before. Typically, our bodies release cortisol on a daily basis, whatever your morning is. Typically for us in school these days, this is morning. Okay. I mean, my wife worked 3 to 11 forever. Maybe, so she typically didn't go to bed till 3 at night and woke up, whatever, somewhere between 9 and 11 and did whatever she had to do and got ready for it, went to work. Maybe her release point was different. And the release point would be different if you're working a midnight shift. So it depends on what time is for you that are there. And so that's why when people were on dose packs, we always discontinued them the way they were formulated and the way they're prescribed, is you take high doses to stop the inflammation, steadily decrease it until typically the last doses are first thing in the morning. That way it doesn't offset it kind of helps you reset your normal release pattern. So all of these things, infections, physical, emotional trauma, the brain can override it. Increase in blood levels of glucose. Also, it will begin to break apart fats and proteins, even then, for energy released that's useful. So its prime metabolic effect is called gluconeogenesis. That means breaking apart fats and proteins to make additional glucose. So, and what's useful about that is it uses fatty acid and saves glucose because the brain needs glucose. The rest of your body can go on different sources. So all of those are different things. So it's something that's constantly being released at times of stress, and there's normal levels that we have throughout. So excessive levels depress cartilage and bone. Excessive levels decrease inflammatory chemicals release. Inflammatory chemicals are generally released by cells that either are damaged or are signaled to explode and release those chemicals. And what most of us believe is that these substances, these steroidal substances, help to stabilize certain cell membranes. They slow down immunological activities. It's not always a good thing. Most of the time, you don't want to limit your immune system. For years, they didn't use hydrocortisone creams on chickenpox, which is extraordinarily, and measles, which are extraordinarily itchy, because they thought that this was going to be, it would depress the immune system's ability to fight a topical, something like that. It was misunderstood. So kids were just, my kids and kids of my age and my own kids who have, before you, the chicken pox immunizations were available, my kids all had chicken pox 2 weeks apart. Bing, bing, bing. Same time. And you're just bathing them and, covering them in calamine lotion and Caladryl and stuff like that. And you use the steroids. All of those things are disrupted. So they can help with, to supplement arthritis. I have some of this stuff at home that I inject when my arthritis flares, if it's necessary. I'm going to do it in about a year. Allergies, all the time, people use those. And this is what happens when people take too much of it. And this is when people, and I commented on it, that was the Meniere's disease. You might remember me telling about that woman who was the same age as my first wife and the wedding and all that. She was the classic picture of being altered by having to take high dose, because that was back in 1978. There was a whole lot of other treatments available. The better part of 50 years ago. Okay. Inhibits inflammation, disrupts neural, cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, etc. So tumor, pituitary, lungs, pancreas, kidney, adrenal cortex, overuse of corticosteroids. Those are all things that can do this. And this is what this gal looked like, and it was very dysfunctional. It caused this massive accumulation because it has, it's like overlaps mineralo activity. So you're taking high doses to treat inflammation or immunological phenomena and diseases, and your body is sucking back fluid and holding on to various things. And you see the picture. That's the picture. So somebody who, like this, a before and an after. And it's more than just, I mean, this gal was, her face probably was almost unrecognizable because the severity at the time of the disease, not obviously one in the illustration. So it gives you an idea. So that's Cushing's syndrome, famously named for that. The offset, and it's rarer, is Addison's disease. Okay, deficits in both glucose and mineraloid, decrease in glucose and sodiums, weight loss, dehydration. You have to replace with corticosteroids. It's interesting. This is fascinating. The early sign is bronzing of the skin because the ACTH triggers melanin. So people with low levels make this ACTH that comes from the pituitary, and it tends to increase melanin. One of the most famous healthy individuals was very, very ill, and it was one of our presidents. So, though you would not remember, obviously, but the late John F. Kennedy, everybody thought, they called it Camelot because it was like a new thing. He had a beautiful wife, Jackie, very, very famous. Was surprised. He was virile. He was a war hero. He was beautifully tan. Little did they know that he had Addison's disease. He knew it, but they wouldn't share that. Same with Franklin Roosevelt in World War II, had polio, but nobody ever saw him. They always saw him if he was addressing Congress. They got him stood up in front of the cameras. And remember, we didn't have TV then; it was mostly radio. Those kinds of things. So nobody knew about till afterwards. Same thing with Kennedy, that he was ill. And obviously it was tragic that he was assassinated, but he surely would not have lived very long. Tons of medication. That's not speaking to his character, which wasn't a good guy. He was a good president, but he was a bad husband. Just saying. See, and it's funny, for my generation, that was the seminal event, the Kennedy assassination, that sort of changed everything in the post-World War II era. For the next generation, it was probably 9/11. I don't know. Hopefully, there won't be an event that's going to be so impactful in your lives that are there. And that was very interesting. And then the adrenal sex hormones, very weak comparatively. When you hear about all these performance, there was a big article just released on ESPN for your ESPN readers, which was the follow up to all of the steroid era in sport, which was so rampant. And it dropped yesterday. And I looked at some of the articles, having been familiar with it. And this is where they begin. This androstenedione is something that's made there, or dehydroepiandrosterone, androsterone, pardon me. Not easy for me to pronounce. What identified this, these laboratories were making substances that were in this kind of category because they were difficult to detect. And every time the sport authorities found a way to detect them, the people who were making it just made another variant that was less detectable. And it became rampant and all of those things. That's when they made it illegal. That's what they found in Mark McGwire back in 1998 when they hit all these home runs, when he and Sammy Sosa had 70 and 60 home runs. And he had a bottle of androstenedione in the bottom of his locker. It wasn't a banned substance, but it was clear what it was doing. So this is where a lot of this came from. Again, in women, this is the only area we make testosterone-like stuff. When men take it, on top of what they already have, what it may do, second, and surely does, onset of puberty, secondary sex characteristic. A lot of people talk about sex drive, estrogens in postmenopausal women, because obviously there's minimal amount of ovarian function in that regard, and sometimes supplements are necessary. And that also sort of delves into that early osteoporosis. They had my first wife who he effectively became menopausal in her mid-30s because of polycystic ovary disease, and they had her on estrogen and progesterone supplements early on, which is part of the reason we couldn't have children biologically. So all of that. Adrenogenital syndrome, masculinization, is the hypersecretion. Obviously not nearly as apparent in males, very disturbing in females and prepubescent males. All those types of things that you can see here. And then the medulla, again, this is more about, to me, the autonomic nervous system than our nervous system, rather than our endocrine system, are these cells that are there that make epinephrine and norepinephrine. And because you looked at this, it doesn't hurt to forget they vasoconstrict, increase heart rate, raise blood glucose, and basically it's fight or flight, divert blood supply. Why they're saying brain, I have no idea. It doesn't divert it to your brain. Your brain always gets the same amount of blood supply. It's heart and skeletal muscle, period. Brain stays the same. That's the whole idea of your circulation, and we'll get into that as well. What's interesting is the epinephrine, more of a stimulator of metabolic activities, bronchial dilation, blood flow to the vessels in the heart. Norepinephrine, more impact on blood pressure. And for a long time, people were using as diet aids. And I realize now it's changed a lot. There's a lot of buzz about that diabetes pill for weight loss, was that the Ozempic and things like that. For a long time, they were making products. You'd get a GNC that had ephedrine, that was a precursor for epinephrine and norepinephrine. It was the early predecessor of amphetamines. It originally was discovered as a compound, are you ready, in certain kinds of Chinese tea that use leaves from that plant, the ephedra plant. And so they used ephedrine derivatives, in making in these. It was called Metabolife was one, and you could buy it anywhere. And they had a lot of people who had very adverse effects because it gave them time. It might have led to stroke, or at the very least led to certain kinds of damage that were unperceived. It caused, at least I can think of 2 deaths in athletes who were taking them for weight loss. And I do not know what the governmental controls are now with regard to it. And again, I don't think you have to say a whole lot more. This is an oddball tumor we every so often clinicians look for when we have unexplained high blood pressure, called a pheochromocytoma, because you have to collect urine for 24 hours to analyze. Pineal gland you learned about in central nervous system. The only thing that we're sure about what it does, it plays a role in body rhythms and timing, whether it's maturity, cycles, sleep, etc. It's that. We know that they sell melatonin. You can buy that as a supplement anywhere. If you have difficulty sleeping, do not plan on the first time taking that so you get a good night's sleep before you have a big exam. Because if you don't, it affects everybody differently. Some people are really wiped out, and some people helps them sleep just fine. You should ascertain that before you start taking that on a regular basis. I really need a good night's sleep tonight, because they'll go out and they have a big long drive, and and then all of a sudden they're so groggy. The fact that something is available over the counter or available as a nutritional supplement does not mean, it just means it's not controlled. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not potentially harmful or have side effects. And people with a lot of experience have these things. I'm trying to remember which one it was that adversely impacted birth control pills. There was some supplement that you could get. You still probably can. I mean, imagine what the problem that would be. Voila, there we are, endocrine organs, et cetera, and we're never going to have time. I'm not going to start it. It's not fair. It's the most important one of these. Let me flip through. We'll do that the next time. Because it's all diabetes. I see if there's anything. I'll get the other ones. Gonads and the placenta. Okay. Testes, testosterone, male reproductive. We deal more with that when we get into that area. At the end of the course here, sperm production, reproductive health, etc. The placenta takes over that role during pregnancy, making all of these necessary ones. We'll get into how the role that the corpus luteum takes over this role in the early days of pregnancy, pre-placental formation. That sort of occurs at the transition from embryo to fetus. Adipose tissue, okay. Leptin plays a role. It also plays a very significant role in the onset of puberty and menstruation. There are other ones here that we now know in adipose have interesting roles that are associated with insulin, and I don't think it really is as well understood that we need to comment on it. And we'll look at a lot of these in what are called enteroendocrine cells. These are endocrine glands that are really single cells that impact the organ that they come from. Gastrin from the stomach impacts the stomach. Secretin is from the small intestine, impacts the liver and the pancreas. Same for cholecystokinin, pancreas, gallbladder, variety of sphincters. Again, we're beginning to learn a lot more about those. Here's the natriuretic peptide. And this is a big player for kidney. It probably got to a bit in bone. We talked about the renin earlier. Erythropoietin, that's the one for all of us, men and women alike, that triggers when red blood cell levels are low, it triggers bone marrow to make more. So that's why folks who have kidney disease or on dialysis frequently are very anemic. And again, there's some that are also in osteoblast, again, insulin related. So we're beginning to understand sort of the fine control, the vitamin D precursors, cholecalciferol, cholecalciferol and calcitriol. Okay, this is where we get the vitamin D sort of in us. It's activated by sunlight, activated by the kidney. Now, once it's activated, this is the active form, and obviously plays a variety of roles. More about vitamin D. Thymosins are something that are part of our immune system. They're the linchpins to make T cells. So that's everything but diabetes. So we'll come back and we'll do diabetes at length when we meet on Tuesday. I'll start the heart in lab. Thank you. Let's want to do another 10 minutes. No. My voice doesn't want to do another 10 minutes.